Following with our theme of salt and light, I will be reading from Matthew 5:13 to 16. Matthew 5:13 to 16. You are the salt of the earth, but if the salt loses its saltiness, how can it be made salty again? It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled underfoot. You are the light of the world. A town built on a hill cannot be hidden. Neither do people light a lamp and put it under a bowl. Instead, they put it on its stand, and it gives light to everyone in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others, that they may see your good deeds and glorify your Father in heaven. Blessings, Marilyn.
I was exploring the idea of serving in a mission assignment again in 2011, went through the process of forming a care team for discernment around me, and set a departure date for February 2013. And as I look back over the last 3 years, I feel incredibly blessed by this congregation, and I don't take the time enough to say thank you. Part of a furlough time that I'm on right now is to give you the opportunity to look back and draw learnings, wisdom, gleanings of what God was doing and what you were learning, and also look ahead and say, what's the next 3-year assignment about? What's my vision for that? What's my hopes? What's my dreams? And in looking back, I feel incredibly blessed by all of you, that I'm not serving in Uruguay as an independent person, but I'm serving as an extension of Nefsville, and I've received your prayers, your emails, your concerns, your comments on Facebook, care packages, Christmas cards, whatever, birthday gifts. I've come home and received financial support in order to continue serving, and I feel incredibly blessed. When I arrived home 2 weeks ago, I felt overwhelmed by just the warmth of your greetings and your hugs. For those of you who remembered Uruguayans kiss on the cheek when they greet, some of you have been doing that for me, and I feel blessed, so thank you. Thank you. I won't be using this morning to give a report about Uruguay. For me, a Sunday morning deserves a message that is far beyond just what I'm doing in Uruguay. In 2 weeks, we'll have a 5th Sunday in November, and we'll have a missions breakfast and a missions sharing time then. So I'll be sharing more specifics about Uruguay, what I'm going back to, why I'm going back, stories of things that have happened in the last 3 years. I'll share all of that during that mission sharing time during the Sunday school hour. There'll be little portions of references to Uruguay this morning, but if you were expecting a full-blown mission report, I don't know whether to say I'm sorry or be at ease. That'll happen on the 29th. I realized when I landed 2 weeks ago that I feel like someone who's trying to catch on to a moving train. Your lives have not been sitting still over the last 3 years, and as a congregation, the life of this congregation has not been sitting still over the last 3 years either. So I'll be here for 3 months. I want to catch up, and yet I recognize I won't be able to. I can't possibly. You are in motion, and I want to enjoy that, catch a glimpse of it, but know that I can't get on the train completely. But I have been able to stay in touch a bit, so I have an idea of some of the things that have been happening. I get the weekly Wednesday emails with the updates. I can listen to sermons online. I'm friends with many of you on Facebook. I get glimpses of what's going on here. And Hunter's message last Sunday also helped me to understand that as a congregation, we're looking at our vision. We're looking at our purpose. We're trying to set direction. And I can appreciate vision. Some of us are wired that we are thinking future all the time. What's going to happen this next year? What are my goals? What am I hoping for? Where are we going? What am I investing in and why? We think like that all of the time. Others of us are more of a day-to-day type of person. We live today, we live the moment. We don't think too much in the future, there's enough today. And we're on a continuum somewhere in between all of that, and that's okay. Sometimes we're in seasons of life that kind of project us into thinking about the future. Other times we're in seasons of life where day by day is all that we can possibly think about. Either way, the Bible tells us that without vision, a people perish. And when we think about leaders, we often think of them as needing to be able to define where we're at, where we hope we're going, where we feel called, drawn to go, and to map a path to get from point A to point B. Here's where we are, here's what we think God wants to be doing. How are we going to live into that? How are we going to grow into that? So I can appreciate vision. One of my goals during my 3 months here at home is to set my vision for my time in Uruguay. I'll plan 1 year at a time, though. I won't plan 3 years at a time. I'm not that brave. But vision. No matter who we are, at some point in our life, probably repeated points in our lives, we will be challenged with the question of, why am I here? Oftentimes it happens at crisis moments, when a course in college, we don't get the grade we want, or the direction we thought we were going with the profession ends up switching, or there's a health diagnosis that catches us by surprise, or there's a job change. When we're faced with crisis, oftentimes we end up asking that question, why am I here? Does my life matter? If it matters, why? How do I bring meaning and vision into this, into me, into what I'm doing? If I were to go on the streets of Lancaster this morning, or if I would just send you all out to your neighbors and friends, and you ask the question, why do you think you're here? What is your life about? We'd probably get a real wide variety of answers. For some people, they would talk about their profession and their job or their business, their status of employment. This is what my life is filled with. For others, maybe they're in the middle of education, going back for a degree or moving from grade to grade. Their education, and when is Christmas vacation here, and when are the finals, and how did I do on that test, fills their life. For some people, it might be wealth and possessions. What house am I looking to buy? Where am I at? Where's my retirement funds? How is the next vacation going to be filled? It can be a source of meaning and purpose in life. For some people, it'll be defined by family and marriage, maybe children or grandchildren or great-grandchildren begin to fill the sense of, this is why I'm here and what I'm investing in and what is going to live on beyond me. So why are we here? Especially as Christians, however we answer that, whatever response we give to that, as believers in God and as followers of Jesus, it defines us. It shapes us. The text that was read earlier from Matthew 5, verses 13 to 16, contains Jesus' words to a large crowd. This crowd was beginning to gather around him. He goes up on a mountainside and he begins to speak. It's important to understand the context that's going on as we look at just these 4 verses. It's only 4 verses that we're looking at. But what is the context? And so I want to explore that with you. I also want to say, for me, every Sunday, we have the children's story, we have the worship, we have the reading of scripture, we have prayer, and I'm ready to just stop there. So, because there's so much there that I just want to unpack and sit with. So I'm going to try to share something a little bit more informative, perhaps a personal message, to fill in where maybe the children's story and the songs missed. But if you're sitting there going, I have enough for the day, I understand. Humor me. So if you would, turn with me to Matthew 5. If you have your Bibles with you. In Matthew 4, the chapter for me, the page before, chapter 4 of Matthew is a hinge chapter. It's a crucial moment in the story of Jesus. Up until now, he's been behind the scenes. There's been a baptism, his baptism, that takes place in chapter 3. In chapter 4, he's led into the wilderness, and he's tested by Satan, and he passes the test. He doesn't give in to the temptations that Satan wants to draw him into getting caught up in. From there, he begins to preach. His very first public message happens in chapter 4. He begins to call his first disciples, and he heals the sick. This is the first miracle of healing that takes place in the entire Gospel of Matthew. Chapter 4 is a hinge chapter. Jesus is shifting from this behind the scenes, learning, growing, developing. We don't know all that might have happened in his first 30 years. Chapter 4, he begins to move into something. And immediately, at the end of chapter 4, we see that large crowds from the region begin to gather around him. So chapter 5, these crowds are gathering, and he decides to go up on the mountainside. Sometimes Jesus was pulled away to have quiet space. He often left the disciples and the crowds in the early morning hours to go have quiet, to have time with the Father. That's not the case here. He's going up on the mountain because he knows this crowd needs space. To stay in the town, in the village, would have limited what happens. And in the beginning of Matthew 5, the first 12 verses of Matthew 5, imagine the crowd that surround him. Who do you see? If he's going to begin a significant ministry, who's there? I had a laugh when I landed back in the U.S. right now. Sports are huge. Anyone notice that? Anyone knowing what game they're going to watch today? Or I have no idea what's on. Yeah, there's some definite enthusiasm over there. Sports is huge. And for those of you who are into football, high school, college, national league, whatever, pro, you know who you want on the team, you know who's injured and you wish wasn't injured, you know the A-list players. Jesus didn't call the A-list players. He's not talking to the cream of the crop on the hillside. The people that are gathering around him are probably a bit of a motley crew. His disciples are there. He's handpicked them. He's called them. But the rest are people who are hungry, who are curious, who have heard rumors or caught a glimpse of him, and they want more. Perhaps they're sick. Perhaps their family members have encouraged them, go see Jesus. He healed some people. There's a motley crew gathered around him. And in the first verses of chapter 5, he redefines who they are. We know these verses as the Beatitudes. I grew up in Sunday school, and I remember a little heavy paper card, and we had little B's that we put the Beatitudes. It was a play on words, but every time we memorized one of these verses, we could put a little bumblebee on this card. Does anyone else remember those at all? You don't have to admit you're as old as I am, or not. But I remember that card, the Beatitudes. But what Jesus is doing in these first 12 verses, even before we get to our text for today, is he's redefining the people in the group that have gathered around him. Each phrase in these verses starts with a blessed are the, and then he names something. And he names things where we would go, how is that blessed? Blessed are the poor in spirit. Blessed are the meek. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. Blessed are the merciful. Blessed are the pure in heart. Blessed are the peacemakers. Blessed are those who are persecuted because of me. Blessed are. And then he goes on, this second half of the phrase is the spoken blessing. So blessed are you. He identifies a category that they could identify with, and then he tells them how they're blessed and how they will be blessed. He redefines them. And then he goes on in verses 13 to 16 to tell them what they're about. First he says, I want you to understand your identity. You are blessed. Your hunger will be met. Your mercy will have an impact. Your attempts at peacemaking will yield peace. And then he says, I want to tell you several things more. In verses 13 to 16, I see two proclamations that Jesus makes. He also makes a comparison. He gives a warning, two warnings, and he ends with a promise. In 4 verses, that's a lot, but I'd like to cover them with you this morning. He makes 2 proclamations. They are that we are the salt of the earth and that we are the light of the world. They're proclamations. I didn't often see that, but as I've been studying this text, it's impressed me that he doesn't say, could you please try to be salt? He doesn't say, hey, do your best at being light. It's not something that he says you're going to have to grow into, you're going to have to do on your own. He declares it. It's a proclamation. You are the salt of the earth. You are the salt of the earth. You are the light of the world. When I hear it like that, it takes on a different tone in my heart than if I hear it like, hey, you better be salt. You got to do your best to be light. Those feel burdensome. Those feel like obligations that I know I fail at. Whether I'm in Uruguay or Lancaster or wherever I am, I fail at them. But when I hear Jesus' words being said, you are these things. You don't have to try to be these things. In my relationship with you and your relationship with me, this happens. You are. You are the salt of the world. When you think of salt, what happens? What comes to mind? I immediately see a salt shaker. And I've borrowed some of the salt shakers from the kitchen and scattered throughout the auditorium where the sign-up book is that got passed earlier, the Who's in Attendance book got passed. There's salt shakers on every 3rd bench. Have you found them? If there's a gap in front of you, it might be on the bench in front of you or off to the side. If you can find it, grab it. When I heard Sherry was going to pass out pretzels to the kids, I thought, you know what, that's what I should do. I should have little bags of pretzels for all of the adults. And then I thought, no, that'll be a very crunchy noise. And secondly, if I was the person cleaning the auditorium tomorrow or later this week, I wouldn't necessarily want all of the crumbs that pretzels can make. So there's a salt shaker there, and if you want to, not obligated, but if you want to, just to have that sense, what does it mean to be salt? What does the flavor of salt taste like? Feel free to put a little bit in your palm of your hand and pass the salt shaker and pass it back through the auditorium. Feel free to do that as we talk further. When I think of salt, I immediately get salivation going on in my mouth. I can't think about salt without that instantaneous response. It just happens. Salt has been used since ancient times as a seasoning and, as Sherry pointed out, as a preservative as well. It has many other uses as well. If you Google it, you will see a long list. Uses of salt, it's incredible. However, years ago, salt was difficult to obtain. Today, we have it. Every kitchen has probably a round container of salt, the Morton's salt shaker. And now, today, we have various flavors of salt. Salts coming from different origins or highlighted with a different seasoning. We've gone crazy about salt. It's universally accessible and it's relatively cheap, but in the past, it was difficult to obtain. And it was a highly valued trade item. In fact, until the 20th century, when the Industrial Revolution kicked in, Salt was so highly valued that it had impact on economies and on wars. Today we think about the issue of petroleum. In the past, before petroleum was a big issue, salt was the item that impacted the world. In the Middle Ages, salt was known as white gold. Salt? We toss it over our shoulder as salt was white gold. In the first century, Roman soldiers of the time were paid a salarium, the basis of our modern word for salary, and the Latin word for salt. Their salary was salt. We even have an expression in English that says someone is worth his salt. It means he's worth his salary, he's a good worker, he's reliable, he's efficient, he's worth his salt. In Jesus' day, salt was an item of great value. It was an essential element in cooking as well as in preserving foods, and without it, food wouldn't have much taste. Therefore, when Jesus says we are the salt of the earth, he's saying we are a people of great value, and we add something essential. We add flavor to this world. Our faith in God, our relationship with him, and our interaction with others adds flavor and the enjoyment that flavor brings. When you bite into something that's perfectly seasoned, we enjoy it. In Uruguay, there's socialized medicine, and because of that, there's also government regulations on various things. And a recent law about 2 years ago was that restaurants may not have salt shakers on their tables. For health reasons, the nation should cut back in its salt consumption. And restaurants are also encouraged to cut back in their use of salt in their preparation of food as well. So if you go into a restaurant in Uruguay, you will have to ask for the salt. They won't offer it to you, they won't naturally bring it to you. That's against the law. You have to ask for it, and then they can fulfill the customer's request. Well, imagine a society, Uruguayans love their salt. Uruguay is not like a Mexican culinary location. Uruguayans season with salt. That's about it. The one day I made this great soup. I had a friend over. I put some curry in the soup because I like a little bit of spice. My friend could hardly eat it. My Uruguayan friend, it wasn't even hot to my taste. But for her, sorry, this is unusual and I can't eat it. Uruguayans have learned to ask for salt because without it, their food, because they don't use other spices, would be very, very bland. I know what it is to sit down and bite into something and say, I don't think there's any seasoning in this. The second proclamation that Jesus makes is that we are the light of the world. In today's artificially lit world, we can easily take light for granted. I've been living in a city in Uruguay, Montevideo, the capital city, 1.7 million people, and there's light everywhere. We flip a switch and a light comes on. It begins to get dark at dusk outside and our street lamps come on. Some of our houses have automatic lights that come on as well when it gets dark or if a storm gathers. Our cars are fitted with high and low beams and a variety of others. We don't experience being in complete darkness very often. I'm the same. Sherry, my bathroom has a little night light in it. I need light if I wake up in the middle of the night. We're very rarely in complete darkness. And if we are, unexpectedly, what do? A storm comes, the lights go out, and what do? We run for a candle, we run for a flashlight, we grab our cell phones nowadays. That's what we do first. That's what I did first a couple of weeks ago. At least your cell phone gives off a little bit of light and can help me see as I stumble around my apartment. We grab anything in order to see. We need light. I want to encourage the children that were given a tea light earlier by Sherry. Find it. If you've laid it down somewhere and it's under a book, in a little bit we're going to use it. With the aid of light, we don't just see, we also experience color. Without light, we don't distinguish color. Light helps us see beyond black and white or gray. Look around you. Imagine not being able to see the colors in this room, or the colors of the sweaters and shirts that we're wearing. What if it was all black and white and gray? I'm looking for Dean. Dean, oh, there you are. I'm going to ask him, it's broad daylight here and the windows are going to let in a lot of light, but I'm going to ask Dean to dim the lights in the auditorium. What happens for us? This reminds me of Uruguay. If the children that have your tea lights could light them and lift them up. This reminds me of Uruguay. There are 2 to 3% of Uruguayans who would claim to be Christians in any way. And there's an incredible openness to other spiritual expressions. I was surprised by how many Uruguayans can quickly tell me their horoscope sign without me asking for it, and how that is so true of them and how that influences the rest of their life. I had a friend of mine, her 12-year-old son, tell me about how the neighbor was telling him about all of this different energy and it affects all of the different parts of his body. This young man is growing in his faith in Christ, and I listened to him explaining all these things his neighbors had told him, and I thought, how do I respond? And I said to Michael, Michael, you know what's more exciting to me than that? Is that we get to know the God who created us. That's above and beyond any of that. We can choose interesting stuff, but you're invited to know God. I was running errands in downtown Montevideo one day and hadn't planned my schedule well, and so I stopped into a Burger King for a bite to eat. And as I'm sitting in the dining room area, there are large screen TVs in the different corners in that dining room area. I assumed they were playing sports, which is usually what's on, but as I looked up, I realized they had the tarot card channel playing. As we're all sitting there grabbing lunch, there's a woman reading tarot cards. And I thought, okay, this is my reality, and I'm one little light in a much bigger world. My light can seem pretty feeble at times, but I'm a light in that world. Thanks, Dean. In Jesus' day, there weren't any electric switches or light bulbs or tea lights. Instead, they lit their homes with oil lamps, and oil lamps require attention. Who last filled it with oil? How low is it getting? Is the wick still functioning, or does it need replaced? And more importantly, is there a fire to light the lamp when it's time to light it? There weren't matches or butane lighters. Light was incredible. It was protected and cherished. It didn't come on at a switch or go off at Dean's hand. When Jesus says, "You are the light of the world," it meant something significant. Jesus makes a comparison. He says, "You are like a city on a hill." A city on a hill. I lived in Europe for a while, and there were lots of castles on hills. I've seen that, but I also know that in reality, there are more cities along rivers and water coastal areas than anywhere else. For transportation, for shipping, for industrial purposes, cities along rivers are more beneficial. Montevideo is one of those cities, the capital city where I'm living. It is a port city. It's along the river. A city on a hill was built for protection. It's hard to invade and attack a city on a hill. The approaching enemy army has a lot of work to do to get up the hill, and the people in the city can take a more defensive posture, can be more protective of their environment. It's seen for miles around. When it's lit up at night, in the dark, it becomes a reference point if anyone's traveling in the nearby area. Oh, I know where I am. It's almost like a North Star kind of thing in a way. And I like this imagery, this comparison, because a city is a corporate and plural entity. More than one person usually lives in a city. If one person is living there, we call it a house. A handful of people might become a village or a town, but a city on a hill involves all of us. And I think it's an incredible imagery for the church. Jesus in this text is saying you, but he's saying it in a plural context. The crowd is around him, and they're hearing it individually, but it's also meant corporately. We add light to this world. We are to be like a city on a hill. There's something inviting and protective and guiding in that. Jesus gives 2 warnings. The first time I read this passage, I didn't put a lot of attention on the warnings that are given. I like that he says, you are salt, you are light. I just want to dwell on that. But he gives 2 warnings, and they deserve attention. The first one is that salt can lose its saltiness. Who knew? It seems like salt that's been in my cupboard lasts forever. But when I moved to Uruguay is a very damp climate. You have a salt shaker on your counter, and it will become clumpy and gross very quickly. So I learned you have to add some grains of salt in it, grains of rice into it. The rice will absorb some of the moisture, but you still have to be careful. If salt is left out and exposed to elements for too long, to light, to temperature changes, to dampness, it loses its flavor. If you keep it in the cupboard for 10 years and pull it out, it might not be as effective. Salt can lose its saltiness, and light can be hidden. Jesus tells us not to hide. He says that we're not to cover up our faith. He says God is not a secret to be kept. He wants us to add something to this world, to be a reference point, a bit of direction, light in the darkness, or color in the midst of gray. I know there are many people in this congregation that are artists, home decoration, construction, painters, potters, sketchers. Color is an important part of life. A light shouldn't be hidden. There will be no color. Jesus goes on and he makes a promise, and it's a powerful promise. The NIV that was read gives us an important piece of the translation. And there was also, I'm realizing I missed something, and I'm trying to go back if you're wondering. There's also a paraphrase version of the Message that I like as well. And this promise stands out a little bit more vividly in the Message. In the Message paraphrase, he says, I'm putting you on a light stand. Now that I've put you there on a hilltop, on a light stand, shine, keep open house, be generous with your lives. By opening up to others, you'll prompt people to open up with God, this generous Father in heaven. Keep open house. Be generous with your lives. By opening up to others, you'll prompt people to open up with God, this generous Father in heaven. That's Jesus' promise that he gives. I can't tell you exactly how to do this. As I was preparing this message, I thought, well, if we're to be salt and light, if we are salt and light, how do we do that? I thought, wouldn't it be nice if I could give a couple of handy tips? And I can't, because I'm still learning day by day how to do this. I can't tell you. That's something that God needs to respond to your inquiries. I have to keep asking God for direction. I have to keep asking him, where are the opportunities so that I don't miss them? What should I say? How can I say it? What should I do? How am I to be salt and light? How am I salt and light? I gave a version of this message 3 weeks ago. My last Sunday in Uruguay, I spoke at the International Church there, a group of about 40 people, a very different setting than today. And I made that comment to them too, that they needed to seek God to figure out what he was calling them to. They needed to seek God for him to reveal to them how they were being salt and light and how they could be even more so. And then I had a crazy week of getting my dog to a friend and closing down my apartment and getting finances to another friend, getting ready to leave, packing my suitcase. I had a long 9.5 hour overnight flight from Montevideo to Miami, Friday into Saturday, an 8-hour layover in Miami, and I was finally on the airplane from Miami to BWI where my family would meet me, and I was just ready to crash. I hadn't slept on the overnight flight. I can't. But instead, out of jostling seats around a little bit to accommodate a couple coming off of a cruise, I ended up seating next to a gentleman who began to talk even before we pulled away from the airport. And we ended up talking for the 2.5-hour flight from Miami to Baltimore. I was not in my best communication-wise. I was pretty groggy, but he was a very intriguing person, and he just talked. And occasionally I would respond. And I realized this is a significant conversation. He was sharing all kinds of information, was coming from Caracas, Venezuela, back to the States. He is an economist working for a government agency, and he didn't tell me more than that, but I was intrigued. But at one point in our conversation, he made the comment that 2 years ago his wife died, and that's changed everything. And then he went on to talk further. And I came back to it. I thought, this is significant. So I said, tell me more about that. And he shared how he always thought he'd die before his wife, that he had retired, his wife hadn't, and then suddenly she was diagnosed with a brain tumor, and 9 months later was gone. And he was not able to hold a full-time job. He would do consulting things, but he couldn't put in 40 hours of work a week because he just couldn't function. And I'm sitting there going, God, what do I say? And I felt prompted. There was something that came to mind. I felt like, and he made the comment at one point that he believes, kind of like the saying goes, man makes their plans and then God laughs. And when he said it, my heart just sank. I just thought, oh, what do I say? And the thing that came to mind as we continued to talk is I wanted to say to him, I don't think God laughs. I think he wept. I think when your wife got that diagnosis, I think through those 9 months, I think even now God weeps with you. He's not laughing. And I wanted to say it, but I was sensitive. How's he going to react? And I'm really a shy person inside, even though I'm talking nonstop right now. When I'm done, I will want to hide in the corner, but I'll shake your hands and you'll hug me and I'll be okay. But so I'm sitting there going, I need to say this, but and I'm also aware that we are that one conversation that the entire plane is hearing. We're at the wings, the engines are running full blast. He has this beautiful, deep, booming voice, and everyone always tells me I talk a lot louder than I think I'm talking. So I am aware that everybody is hearing this, and I am intimidated to no end. And I didn't say anything. I made the comment at one point that we live in a broken world and our hearts aren't made for this brokenness. I did say that. But we ended up getting off of the plane and we lost touch as we went to to retrieve our suitcases, and I didn't say, I think God weeps. I don't think he's laughing. I didn't say it because I was too intimidated. I was too fearful. I was trying to be sensitive, but that was an excuse. And I knew it when I got off the plane. So I've been praying for him. His interaction with God isn't dependent on me, but I missed an opportunity. When I was prepping for the message, I was going to grab a bucket. The message paraphrase of these verses says, we don't place a bucket over. The NIV says, I think, a basket. I can't quite remember. And I was going to, this was in my head, I was going to come and place this bucket over top of our peace lamp. What does it mean when we cover up our light. And I thought, you know what? That feels sacrilegious to me. I can't do it. I can't do it. For us, that lamp is a sign of hope. After the devastation in Paris this week, we need that light. I need that light. After my failure to say something to the gentleman sitting next to me, I need a reference point to go back to. I need the light of Christ. I can't put a bucket over that lamp. So why do I put a bucket over the light that shines out of me to the world around me? Why do I let myself be intimidated? Why do I pull back? Why am I more concerned about what the passengers around me are going to think on a flight than what the man sitting next to me, who's caught in deep grief for over 2 years, needed to hear? When we withhold ourselves, when we take a self-protective stance, when we're moved out of fear, when we hold back our generosity and our openness, our salt and our light, we deprive the world of something really significant. God is our source as we try to live out who he is to the world around us. We can't do it on our own. But as we experience his love for us, as we live in his flavor and light and color in our hearts and in our worlds, in our interactions, others will see. He miraculously shows up. So Matthew 5:13-16 has 2 proclamations. We are salt and we are light. We are compared to a city on a hill. He gives 2 warnings. Salt can lose its saltiness, and we can be tempted to cover up our light. And he gives a promise. He gives a promise. Others will taste and see that the Lord is good. This is why we're here.